Content. I still remember the summer evening when my grandmother first told me about Choo Choo Charles. It was a warm August night, and we were sitting on the porch of her old Victorian house, surrounded by the sleepy sounds of rural America. She took a long drag from her cigarette, exhaled slowly, and began to spin the tale of the legendary train. It started with whispers among the locals, who spoke in hushed tones about a mysterious locomotive that stalked isolated roads at night. They called it Choo Choo Charles, a name that seemed almost nursery rhyme-like, a jarring juxtaposition of innocence and menace. The story went that if you heard the train's engine, you couldn't resist its hypnotic pull, like a moth drawn to flame. My grandmother's eyes sparkled as she spoke, her voice dripping with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She told me about drivers who had vanished on those deserted roads, leaving behind only the faint hum of the train's engine and the eerie feeling that they were being pulled into another realm. As I listened, a shiver ran down my spine. It was as if I was hearing the whispers of the past, echoes of a dark history that refused to be silenced. My grandmother paused, took another drag on her cigarette, and leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Some say it's an old train, one that's been around since the war. She began, her eyes glinting in the fading light. Others claim it's a harbinger of doom, a cursed train that stalks the highways, seeking out the unwary and the lost. She paused again, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge. I was hooked. I had to know more about Choo Choo Charles, this monster of the night that seemed to embody both terror and fascination. Little did I know, my life was about to become intertwined with the train's dark history, leading me down a path from which there was no return. I'll never forget the night I first heard the whispers of Choo Choo Charles. It was a typical autumn evening, the kind where the sky is painted with hues of crimson and gold. My friend Alex and I had decided to take a drive out to the countryside, leaving the city behind for a few hours. We were both in our early 20s, feeling invincible and reckless. Little did we know, this night would change us forever. We were driving on a deserted road, the GPS leading us further and further away from civilization. The only sound was the hum of the engine, the soft whoosh of the wind outside, and the occasional creak of the old car's suspension. It was peaceful, almost serene. That was when we heard it. At first, I thought it was just another car in the distance, but then the engine grew louder, more menacing. The sound sent shivers down my spine as I realized it wasn't a car at all. It was a train, its engine roaring like a beast awakened from a deep slumber. Alex slammed on the brakes, and we skidded to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The train's headlights illuminated us, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. We sat there, frozen in terror, as the train hurtled past us, its engine growing fainter with each passing second. I felt like I was being pulled towards it, as if some unseen force was drawing me closer. Alex grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of our hearts. I shook my head, still trying to process what we had just witnessed. "I don't know," I replied, my voice equally hushed, "but I think it's following us." We sat there for a few minutes, watching as the train vanished into the darkness. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with an unspoken threat. We knew then that we were not alone on this deserted road. As we continued driving, the feeling of being watched never left us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the train's headlights glowing in the rearview mirror. But there was never anything, just the darkness and the sound of our own ragged breathing. As the days went by, I began to hear more about Choo Choo Charles from other drivers who had encountered the train on isolated roads. They shared their own stories of being stalked and mesmerized by the train's hypnotic engine. It was as if the legend was spreading like wildfire, each account weaving together a tapestry of terror that seemed all too real. There was Sarah, a truck driver who claimed to have seen Choo Choo Charles on the highway, its headlights illuminating her cabin like a beacon of doom. She said she felt an intense, creeping sense of dread as the train passed by, its engine seeming to crawl across the asphalt like a living thing. Then there was Mark, a college student who had been driving home from a late-night party when he heard the train's engine in the distance. He claimed that his car wouldn't start, no matter how many times he tried to turn the key. It wasn't until the train passed by that his engine roared back to life, as if it had been drained of all energy. Even the local sheriff seemed to have a story to tell. He spoke of a driver who had vanished on the highway after hearing the train's engine, only to reappear days later with no memory of where he'd been or what had happened to him. The sheriff's eyes would cloud over when he spoke of this incident, as if the very memory was still etched into his mind like a scar. As I listened to these accounts, I began to realize that Choo Choo Charles was more than just a myth. It was a living, breathing entity that seemed to be drawing people in with an otherworldly allure. I knew then that I had to find out more about the train's dark history and the reason behind its hypnotic power. I began my research by scouring local archives and libraries, searching for any mention of a train like Choo Choo Charles. The more I dug, the more elusive the information seemed to become. It was as if the train had never existed, or at least, its history had been carefully erased from the records of time. But I wasn't one to give up easily. I spent countless hours poring over dusty old newspapers and microfiche documents, looking for any clue that might lead me to the truth. That's when I stumbled upon an old news article from the 1950s, detailing a train derailment on a remote stretch of highway. The article mentioned a locomotive with the number Charles, but it was quickly dismissed as a typo by the journalist. However, something about the story didn't sit right with me. I spent hours scouring online archives and talking to local historians, trying to track down any information that might confirm or debunk the story. And then, one day, I received a cryptic message from an anonymous source claiming to have worked on the train's maintenance crew back in the 1950s. They agreed to meet with me at a local diner, and as I sat across from them, sipping on a cup of coffee, they revealed a shocking truth. Choo Choo Charles was indeed a real train, but it had been retired decades ago due to mysterious incidents that left many of its crew members with unexplained psychological trauma. The source claimed that the train's engine had been modified in some way, imbuing it with an otherworldly energy that seemed to draw people in like moths to a flame. They warned me away from investigating further, saying that I was playing with forces beyond my control. I tried to warn others about the dangers of Choo Choo Charles, but they just laughed it off as a silly urban legend. That was until I started hearing whispers from people who claimed to have seen the train in different parts of town. At first, it was just isolated incidents, but soon the sightings became more frequent and widespread. People were sharing their own encounters on social media, using hashtags like Choo Choo Charles and the hypnotic train. The legend was spreading like wildfire, and I knew I had to do something to stop it before it was too late. That's when I met Alex, a charismatic and well-connected individual who claimed to be the self-proclaimed protagonist of Choo Choo Charles. He saw himself as a crusader, determined to uncover the truth behind the train's mysterious power and expose it to the world. As we talked, I realized that Alex was obsessed with the legend, poring over every article, interview, and rumor he could find. His enthusiasm was infectious, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that he was hiding something. Despite my reservations, I found myself drawn into his orbit, attending conferences and events where he was the guest speaker. He spoke about Choo Choo Charles with a conviction that bordered on fanaticism, weaving a spell of intrigue and excitement around the legend. The more he talked, the more I became convinced that there was something to this story, something big. And Alex seemed to sense it too, his eyes gleaming with an unspoken understanding whenever we discussed the train's possible connections to otherworldly forces. As the days turned into weeks, our conversations grew longer and more intense, like we were dancing on the edge of a precipice. I knew that I had to tread carefully, but a part of me was eager to see where this journey would lead. As I delved deeper into the world of Choo Choo Charles, I started to notice a strange connection between myself and the legend. It began with small things: a similar tattoo on my arm, a faint scent that reminded me of old trains, or an inexplicable feeling of being drawn to the train's route whenever I was near it. At first, I dismissed these coincidences as mere luck or fate, but as they continued to pile up, I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something more at play. One night, I received a mysterious package in the mail with no return address and no indication of who sent it. Inside, I found an old photograph of myself as a child, standing next to a train that looked eerily similar to Choo Choo Charles. The date on the photo was from the year I turned 10, and I had no memory of ever being near that train. Panic set in as I realized that this image might be more than just a strange coincidence. It might be proof that I was somehow connected to the legend. I began to research my family history, searching for any possible connections to trains or railroads. And then I found it, an old diary belonging to my great-grandfather, who had worked as a conductor on one of the earliest trains in the United States. As I flipped through the pages, I discovered that he had made a pact with a mysterious figure, trading his soul for the power to control the rails and move the train at will. The entry was dated 1950s, around the same time period as the Choo Choo Charles legend began to emerge. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that I might be the descendant of this pact, and that the legacy of Choo Choo Charles had been following me for years. I was sitting in Alex's office, poring over old records and documents related to Choo Choo Charles, when he suddenly stood up and excused himself. I followed him to a small room on the back of his building, where a single light bulb cast an eerie glow. He fiddled with some wires and dials, and then pressed a button that made the lights flicker. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, and a small screen in front of us sprang to life. The image was grainy and distorted, but I could make out a train approaching from the distance. As it drew closer, the camera panned across its side, revealing the iconic locomotive of Choo Choo Charles. But this wasn't just any photo, there was something strange about it. The train seemed to be moving on its own, as if guided by an invisible force. Alex's eyes gleamed with excitement as he watched the image unfold. "This is it," he whispered. "The signal has been sent." I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized what was happening. This wasn't just a random image, it was a message, a guide to some unknown destination. Alex seemed to sense this too, his eyes locked on the screen with an unnerving intensity. He took a step forward, and then another until he was standing right in front of the screen. "Follow me," he said, his voice low and urgent. I hesitated for a moment, but something about his words drew me in. I stepped forward too, into the unknown, as Alex led us towards some destination that only the mysterious signal could reveal. As we followed the trail of clues, the landscape around us began to change. The streets became increasingly deserted, and the buildings seemed to grow taller and more ominous. Alex led the way, his eyes fixed intently on some unknown destination. I struggled to keep up, my senses on high alert as we navigated through the winding alleys and side streets. Every now and then, Alex would stop and examine a small piece of paper or a cryptic message scrawled on a wall. He'd mutter to himself, his brow furrowed in concentration, before nodding and continuing onward. I began to feel like I was trapped in some sort of surreal dream, where the lines between reality and fantasy were constantly blurring. The air grew thick with an otherworldly energy, as if we were being drawn into a vortex that threatened to consume us whole. And yet, despite the creeping sense of unease, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were getting close, that there was something just beyond the horizon, waiting for us like a siren's call. As we walked, the buildings began to give way to open spaces. Parks and gardens, once serene and peaceful, now seemed twisted and corrupted by some unseen force. The trees loomed above us, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. And then in the distance I saw it, a massive, ancient train station, its entrance guarded by two imposing stone statues. The sign above the entrance read Choo Choo Charles Depot, and as we approached, I could feel the weight of history bearing down upon us. Alex stopped at the entrance, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. He took a deep breath and then turned to me with an unnerving smile. "We're here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and with that he stepped forward into the heart of the mystery. As we stepped into the depot, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being watched. The air was thick with the scent of old trains and decay, and the silence was oppressive. Alex led the way, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space as if searching for something. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks, his head cocked to one side as if listening to some distant sound. I froze, my ears straining to pick up anything out of the ordinary, and then I heard it too, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from all around us. It was a sound I had never heard before, yet somehow it felt familiar. Alex's eyes locked onto mine, and I saw a glimmer of recognition there. "It's him," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the din of the engine. "Choo Choo Charles is here." I spun around, scanning the platform for any sign of movement, and then I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the station, its back to us. The rusted metal of the locomotive seemed to be breathing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that this was no ordinary train. This was Choo Choo Charles, the legendary engine of mystery and terror. Alex took another step forward, his eyes fixed on the figure. "We have to get closer," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We have to know what it wants." I hesitated, my heart racing with fear. But something about Alex's words compelled me to move forward, to see this through to its twisted conclusion. Together, we took another step into the unknown, leaving behind the safety of the depot and stepping onto a journey from which there was no return. As we stepped onto the train, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. The world around us began to blur and distort, like a reflection in rippling water. Alex's eyes were fixed on the figure of Choo Choo Charles, his face twisted in a mixture of fascination and fear. And then, without warning, the train lurched forward and we were swept up in its vortex. The last thing I saw was the depot, receding into the distance like a model car being swallowed by a giant mouth. Everything after that was a blur of color and sound, a cacophony of screeching metal and wailing horns that threatened to shatter my sanity. When I came to, I was lying on a cold, hard floor, surrounded by unfamiliar walls. The air was thick with the smell of grease and smoke, and the only light came from flickering fluorescent tubes overhead. Alex was nowhere to be seen, but I knew he had been taken. I could feel it in my bones. Panic set in as I scrambled to my feet, stumbling through the darkness in search of a way out. But every door I tried led only to more corridors, more identical-looking rooms filled with strange equipment and humming machinery. It was like being trapped in some sort of twisted nightmare, with no escape from the terror that surrounded me. And then I heard the voice, low, raspy, and dripping with malevolent intent. "Welcome aboard, my friend," it said. "You're going to need a lot more than just your wits to survive what's coming." I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one in sight. The words seemed to be echoing off the walls themselves, making me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. I stumbled forward, desperate to find some kind of refuge from the madness that surrounded me. But every step led only to more questions, more terrors, and more despair. I was trapped in a living hell with no way out. And then the lights went out, plunging me into total darkness. As I emerged from the darkness, I was met with an eerie silence. The fluorescent lights flickered back to life, casting an otherworldly glow over the abandoned platform. Alex stood before me, his eyes sunken, his skin pale. "What happened?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog from my mind. "I don't know," I replied, "but I think we need to get out of here." We stumbled through the deserted station, searching for a way out, until finally we saw a glimmer of light on the horizon. As we emerged into the bright sunlight, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived. Alex's eyes locked onto mine, and he spoke in a voice that sent shivers down my spine. "You know what happened to us, don't you?" he asked, his words dripping with accusation. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. And then the truth began to unravel before me like a twisted tapestry. Choo Choo Charles wasn't just a train. It was a vessel for something ancient and malevolent. Something that had been awakened by human curiosity and greed. The engine had taken us on a journey through realms beyond our understanding, realms where the laws of physics were mere suggestions. We had seen things that no human should ever have to see, experienced horrors that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. And then there was the question of what we had become. Had we been changed by our experiences? Had we been transformed into something new, something monstrous? I looked at Alex and saw in his eyes a reflection of my own terror. We had been forever changed by our encounter with Choo Choo Charles. The truth was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was a revelation that left me breathless and shaken, yet also strangely liberated. As I stood there, surrounded by the desolate landscape, I felt a sense of unease wash over me. The truth about Choo Choo Charles had been revealed, and yet it seemed to have left me with more questions than answers. Alex and I had been forever changed by our experiences, but what did that really mean? Were we still human, or were we something more, something less? The uncertainty was suffocating, like a weight that pressed down upon my chest. And yet, as I looked out at the endless expanse of nothingness, I felt a sense of liberation. We had been released from the shackles of reality, allowed to see the world for what it truly was, a vast and terrifying playground. The engine's final words echoed in my mind. "You'll never be the same again." And I knew that it was true, but what did that even mean? Was it a blessing or a curse? I didn't know, and maybe I never would. All I could do was stand there, frozen in time, as the world whirled on around me like a madman's carousel. The sun beat down upon my face, casting long shadows across the ground. It was a cruel joke, this existence of ours. We were born to suffer, to struggle, and to find meaning in the most unexpected places. And yet, even in the midst of all this chaos, I felt at peace. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, like a bird's wing beating against my skin, but it was there nonetheless. A sense of resolution, of closure that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the knowledge that we had seen the truth, no matter how terrible it was. Maybe it was the understanding that we would always carry this experience with us, like a scar on our soul. Whatever it was, it gave me the strength to take one final step forward. And as I did, I felt the ground give way beneath my feet. The world spun around me once more, but this time I was ready. For in that moment, I knew that I could face anything at all.